Welcome back to Talk Tensors, our deep dive into the latest and greatest in machine learning research.
Absolutely. Always exciting to see what's new and breaking in the field.
Yeah, well, today we're diving into, it's a pretty compelling paper, I'd say.
Definitely caught my eye as well. It's got
a lot going on, that's for sure.
Yeah.
The approach is called SKG-LLM. I'll just get that out of the way. And it's about building knowledge graphs.
Okay.
For stroke research.
Interesting. So very domain specific.
Very domain specific, yeah. But what's cool about it is it's using this combination of rigorous mathematical models,
right,
and then the power of large language models.
And they specifically call out GPT-4.
Yeah, GPT-4.
Which is, kind of the big one right now, the state of the art, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah.
So using that to actually construct these knowledge graphs, pretty fascinating.
Exactly. And this is really important because we're just seeing this almost overwhelming surge in the amount of scientific literature being published all the time.
It's a fire hose, right? It's a fire hose of information.
Yeah, it's how do you even keep up, right? And so particularly in biomedicine, which is what this paper focuses on.
Yeah, it's just exploding and,
how do you sift through all of that and find the real gems, the insights that can really drive progress?
Well, and then how do you connect those, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's not just about finding the individual facts or data points. It's how do they all fit together? How do they relate to each other? And that's particularly critical in a field like stroke research, where you have all these interacting factors, causes, symptoms, treatments, risk factors.
It's super complex. And the traditional methods of, extracting knowledge and trying to organize it, they haven't really been able to fully grapple with this level of complexity.
They kind of hit a wall, yeah.
So that's why this SKG-LLM approach is so intriguing, because it's can we use these incredibly powerful AI tools to help us build these really smart maps of information?
Like a knowledge graph is kind of I always picture it as like a concept map on steroids or something, right? You have these nodes, which are the key concepts, and then you have the links, the edges that show how those concepts are related.
Right, right. It's not just here's a list of things, it's here's how they all connect and influence each other.
And in this case, they're really laser focused on stroke-related research articles, so it's a very specific knowledge domain.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that makes this work so interesting is that it's not just saying, oh, LLMs can do everything.
Right.
It's saying, okay, how do we combine these really powerful tools with a solid mathematical framework?
The best of both worlds.
The best of both worlds, exactly.
So you get that kind of, the rigorous structure from the mathematical side, and then the ability to really understand and parse the language from the LLM.
Yeah, and what they do here, which is really interesting, is that they use GPT-4. It's not just oh, we'll use it for a quick initial scan.
No.
It's deeply integrated throughout the whole process.
It's woven in, yeah.
So it's doing things right at the beginning, taking this raw text, these research papers, and cleaning it up, normalizing the language, and creating these really sophisticated embedding vectors.
Right, which, for folks who might not be super familiar with embeddings, it's basically a way to represent the meaning of words and phrases in a way that the computer can actually understand and work with. So it's not just looking at words as strings of character.
It's getting at the semantics, right?
Yeah, it's getting at the meaning underneath those words.
And then, as the knowledge graph is being built, GPT-4 is still there, helping to identify the key concept and really crucially, the relationships between those concepts.
Yeah, so it's not just spotting that, stroke and rehabilitation appear in the same article.
Right.
It's understanding that, rehabilitation is a treatment for stroke.
Right. And maybe even going deeper, what kind of rehabilitation? How effective is it?
Exactly. Starting to map out those nuances.
So then, being good scientists, they put this SKG-LM through its paces, right? They evaluate it.
Put it to the test.
Yeah, using these standard metrics like precision and recall.
The bread and butter of the valuation.
Yeah, so precision is telling us, how accurate is the system at identifying correct relationships?
Out of all the relationships it flags, how many are actually true relationships?
Yeah, and then recall is saying, okay, out of all the true relationships that are out there in the literature, how many did it actually manage to find?
Did it miss any?
Yeah, did it miss any?
Important question.
Yeah, and the results are, they're pretty impressive.
Yeah, especially given that this is a pretty new approach, they got some really promising initial scores on both precision and recall, just with GPT-4 doing its thing.
Right, but then they took it a step further, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, the human in the loop.
They brought in the experts, right, actual stroke researchers to look at the graph, and they're able to refine it, make some tweaks.
That human touch, that human judgment.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that they were actually able to increase the precision.
Wow.
while still maintaining a really high level of recall. So it suggests that, the AI is doing a lot of the heavy lifting,
Great foundation.
building this great foundation, but that human expertise is still so valuable for like catching those subtle details, ensuring that it's really accurate.
That makes a lot of sense. The AI can handle the scale, but the humans are still the experts in the nuances of the field.
Absolutely. And then they compare it to, these existing knowledge graphs out there like Wikidata and WN18RR, which are, pretty well established.
Yeah, they've been around for a while.
And SKG-LLM, held its own, performed very well, particularly when it came to the accuracy of those relationships, that precision.
Which I think is really the heart of it, right?
Yeah.
You want to be confident in those connections.
You want a knowledge graph you can trust, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And the end result, the knowledge graph they built, is really substantial.
Oh, yeah.
Thousands of interconnected concepts. It's a pretty detailed map of this whole research area.
So it's not just, a little toy knowledge graph.
No, it's a serious one.
It's a serious piece of work.
Yeah. So to really appreciate why this is, such a big deal, I think we need to step back a bit and look at the bigger picture of biomedical research.
Yeah, zoom out a little bit.
This didn't come out of nowhere, right? There's a reason why this kind of approach is so needed right now.
Yeah, there's a whole context here.
It's this huge, we've talked about it before, but it's this, almost exponential increase in biomedical.
It's a knowledge explosion.
Yeah, and it's being driven by, more research being done, more data being generated, more powerful tools for analysis being developed.
Yeah, and it's a good problem to have in a sense, right?
Yeah, it's a good problem to have, but it also creates this, almost a data overload problem.
It does.
And that's why we need these innovative solutions like SKG-LLM.
Yeah, because it's not enough to just have the data, right? You have to be able to make sense of it, extract the knowledge from it, and that's where things get tricky.
Yeah, and the paper does a good job of, kind of connecting this to this bigger picture of what's happening in biomedicine, the rise of big data.
That buzzword. But it's a real thing, right?
It is a real thing.
Just the sheer volume of data, the different types of data being collected, the speed at which it's all coming in.
Yeah, it's like drinking from a fire hose, and so they talk about how this has led to, this idea of biomedical knowledge graphs, BKGs.
As a way to try and wrangle all this data.
Yeah, to organize it, to navigate it, to actually make it useful.
And they highlight stroke research as a really good example of a field that could really benefit from this kind of approach because it's so complex.
So complex, yeah. And the paper points out, kind of the limitations of traditional methods.
Yeah, where they fall short.
Yeah, so they might be able to, identify the key entities, like you were saying, the diseases, the genes, the treatments.
It's like pull those out of the text.
But then when it comes to teasing out the relationships, how do they interact? What are the cause and effect links, the dependencies, the nuances?
Right, the more subtle connections.
That's where those older methods kind of struggle.
Yeah, because you're moving beyond simple keyword matching at that point, right?
Right, you need something that can really understand the meaning, the context.
You need something that can understand language like a human.
And that's where, this whole explosion in large language models has come in, right?
Yeah, in the last decade or so, it's been remarkable.
Driven by, again, massive amounts of data, advancements in computing power.
And these models have become incredibly good at understanding and generating human language.
Right, to the point where it's, sometimes it's even hard to distinguish from,
From a human, yeah.
And so the paper talks about some of the earlier work that's been done, kind of exploring the synergy between LLMs and knowledge graphs.
Laying the groundwork.
Yeah, so they mentioned things like dr.notes, which was using LLMs and medical knowledge graphs for diagnosis prediction.
Oh, interesting.
And the idea there was that it could not only provide a diagnosis, but also explain its reasoning.
So kind of like, not just the what, but the why.
The why, yeah, exactly, which is so important in medicine, right?
Absolutely.
And then they mentioned ROG, which stands for reasoning on graphs.
Okay.
Which was an approach that was trying to, make the reasoning process of LLMs more transparent.
Oh, so using the knowledge graph to kind of shine a light on how the LLM is actually thinking.
Exactly. Make it more interpretable, which is a big, area of research in AI right now.
It's a black box problem, right?
Huge black box problem.
So anything that can make those decisions more understandable, more explainable is a huge plus.
And then they talk about some of the, the work that's been done specifically in using LLMs to build knowledge graphs in certain medical domains like heart failure.
Right, getting into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, and then building specialized knowledge bases like ACE-DKB for autism spectrum disorder.
So really, pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
And all of this earlier work, it's really interesting because it kind of shows this evolution, right?
Yeah, like building blocks.
And the increasing recognition that these two things, LLMs and knowledge graphs, they can work really well together.
Synergistic.
Synergistic, yeah. And the fact that there's been a lot of research on using LLMs to evaluate knowledge graphs, that just shows how intertwined these things are becoming.
Yeah, they're not just separate things. They're really feeding into each other.
Okay, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of, how this SKG-LM actually works.
Yeah, let's crack it open.
They call their methodology SDDSD.
Okay.
And the first step is data set extraction.
Makes sense. Got to start with the data.
You got to have the data, right? So their focus was on stroke research publications that were indexed in PubMed.
Okay, the big database.
The big database, which includes Medline.
Yeah.
And they focused on a pretty recent period, 2020 up to July of 2024.
So pretty up-to-date stuff.
Yeah, and to make sure they were getting the right papers, they used specific keywords.
Oh, yeah, that's important.
Like stroke, ischemic stroke, stroke rehabilitation, and even just brain.
To kind of cast a wider net.
Wider net, yeah, but still within that domain.
Yeah.
And it's important to note this wasn't just like a completely automated, go fetch all the papers.
No, the human touch.
They actually had experts manually review the papers.
To weed out any that weren't really relevant?
That weren't really about stroke. So that's a really important step because it's ensuring the quality of the data right from the beginning.
Absolutely. Garbage in, garbage out, as they say.
Yeah, and the result was a corpus of almost 1,300 research papers.
That's a pretty good chunk of data.
Yeah, that's a good starting point.
Solid foundation.
So next step is data pre-processing with LLMs.
Okay, so this is where GPT-4 starts flexing its muscles.
Yeah, this is where it really shines.
So what's involved in that?
So they have a few sub-steps here.
Okay.
The first one is text cleaning and normalization, which is basically, think of it as like tidying up the raw text.
Getting it all nice and neat.
So removing things like punctuation marks, numbers, special characters, extra spaces.
Makes sense. Get rid of the clutter.
Yeah, and then they convert everything to lowercase, correct any spelling errors, and remove those common words, the stop words, like the and a.
Which, they don't really carry a lot of meaning. They're just kind of grammatical blue.
Exactly. And this is all important because it helps to ensure consistency in the data.
Right. And reduce any noise that could throw off the machine learning models later on.
Exactly. So the paper represents this step as, cleared text equals LLM of raw text, which is a pretty concise way of putting it.
Yeah, the LLM is doing the cleaning.
Doing the cleaning, yep.
And then what?
So then they move on to text to embeddings. And again, GPT-4 is the star here.
Okay.
It's used to generate these dense, high-dimensional vectors that represent the text.
Those embeddings we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and these embeddings, they're really designed to capture the meaning of the words and phrases in a way that a computer can actually work with.
Like a mathematical representation of meaning?
Exactly. And the paper represents this as E equals LL embedding of clean text. So it's taking that clean text and turning it into these vectors.
Okay, so now we're starting to get into the more, the mathematical side of things.
Yeah. And then the final step in this pre-processing phase is constructing data tensors.
Tensors, now we're talking.
So this is where the data really starts to take on this structured mathematical form.
Okay.
They create this multi-dimensional array, which they call T-data.
Okay.
And it's designed to represent the key components that they've extracted from the text.
So like what kind of components are we talking about?
So you have the entities themselves, which are things like diseases, symptoms.
Treatments, right.
The things, yeah. And then you have the relationships or actions that connect these entities.
The verbs, so to speak.
Yeah, the verbs, like causes, treatment for, related to.
Okay, so it's starting to build a map.
It's starting to build a map, and then they even have attributes associated with these actions.
Attributes. So like what?
So like, the intensity of a symptom or the frequency of a treatment.
Okay, so getting really specific.
Getting really specific. And the final tensor, T-data, they represent it as entities, tensor product adactions, tensor product attributes. So it's like combining these different dimensions of information into this multidimensional space.
Like a data cube.
Yeah, like a data cube where each layer represents a different aspect of the information.
That's a good visualization.
So we're going from this unstructured text to this really structured mathematical representation.
And the LLM is playing a key role in that transformation, right?
Yeah, it's not just like we're throwing the text into a random mathematical formula. It's using the understanding of the language to help build this structure.
That's cool.
Yeah, so the next stage in their methodology is parameter estimation.
Okay, getting into the math.
Yeah, and this is where some of the really, interesting statistical concepts come in.
All right, hit me.
So the first one is mutual information calculation.
Okay, and mutual information, that's all about how much information one variable tells you about another, right?
Right. So in this case, they're using GPT-4 to estimate how much knowing about one entity tells you about another entity within the context of stroke research.
So like if you know someone has a certain symptom, How much does that tell you about the likelihood of them having a certain disease?
Exactly. And they have this formula for quantifying this reduction in uncertainty.
Right, because if two things are closely related, knowing one will give you a lot of information about the other.
Yeah, and then they move on to building probability matrices.
Which is basically just a table of probabilities, right?
Yeah, so they lay out the calculated joint probabilities of different entities being related to each other.
So like the probability of entity A and entity B having a certain type of relationship.
Exactly. And again, GPT-4 is doing a lot of the work here, analyzing the text and figuring out these probabilities.
So it's not just based on some, predefined rules. It's actually learning from the data.
Learning from the data, yeah. And then they do this thing called logarithmic normalization.
Which, as the name suggests, it's applying a logarithm to those probability values.
Yeah, and this is a pretty common technique in statistics and machine learning.
It helps to make the numbers more interpretable, and sometimes it can improve the performance of the models.
Right, and they have a little epsilon value in there to avoid taking the logarithm of 0, which is always a good idea.
Math tricks.
Math tricks.
Okay, so now we're getting to what I think is the really exciting part, the entity and relationship extraction.
Yeah, this is the core of the knowledge graph building process.
So this is where they actually identify the nodes and the edges.
Yeah, so they use something called named entity recognition, NER, to identify and classify the key entities.
So like spotting the diseases, the genes, the treatments in the text.
Yeah, and then relation extraction, RE, to figure out the connections between those entities.
Okay, so NER is finding the things, and RE is figuring out how they're connected.
Exactly, and they use some pretty advanced probabilistic models here.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they talk about Bayesian networks, BN.
Okay, those are good for representing probabilistic relationships between variables.
Right, so they're using it to calculate the likelihood of a specific type of relationship existing between two entities, taking into account all sorts of information they've extracted from the text.
So like, is this entity a cause of this other entity?
Exactly, and GPT-4 is helping out here by not only identifying potential entities, but also suggesting potential relationships.
So it's like a brainstorming partner.
Yeah, and then they use latent dirichlet allocation, LDA, which is a topic modeling technique.
Okay, topic modeling, that's all about finding the hidden themes in a collection of documents.
Exactly. So in this case, they're using it to discover the underlying topics in the research papers.
Which can then give you clues about potential relationships that might not be explicitly stated.
Right, because sometimes things are related even though they don't appear right next to each other in the text.
Right, it's all about the implicit connections.
And then they use this technique called tensor decomposition.
Okay, back to tensors.
Yeah, specifically canonical polyadic decomposition, CP decomposition.
Gotcha.
And this is basically a way of breaking down that complex data tensor we talked about earlier into its more fundamental components.
So like deconstructing the data cube.
Yeah, and this helps them to understand the underlying structure of the relationships and to estimate the probability of a specific relationship existing.
So it's like finding the building blocks of the relationships.
Yeah, and the last stage in their methodology is model optimization.
Okay, so now they've got this model. They've got all these parameters. How do they make sure it's the best it can be?
So they use the expectation maximization algorithm, EM algorithm.
Oh yeah, that's a class.
It's an iterative process for finding the best values for the parameters of the model.
So it's like, tweaking the knobs until you get the best sound.
Exactly, and it involves these two steps, the expectation step and the maximization step.
E&M, hence the name.
And they repeat these steps until the model converges, meaning it stops getting any better.
So it's a process of continuous improvement.
Yeah, so they go through this whole, intricate process, and then what are the results?
Yeah, what did they actually find?
Well, GPT-4 was able to identify 13 different types of nodes.
That's a good number.
Yeah, so everything from diseases and symptoms to genes, proteins, biomarkers, even hospitals, researchers, publications.
So it's capturing a pretty broad range of concepts.
Yeah, very comprehensive, and then 24 different types of edges connecting those nodes.
Wow, so a lot of different relationships.
Yeah, like causes, treats, associated with, symptom of, all sorts of things.
So it's a pretty rich knowledge graph.
Very rich, and then to evaluate it, they used a bunch of different methods.
Okay, good. They didn't just say, trust us, it works.
No, they actually put it to the test.
So what kind of evaluation did they do?
So they used traditional metrics like precision, recall, and the F1 score, which is a combination of those two.
Right, the classics.
But they also did this really cool thing where they used LLMs for evaluation.
Oh, that's interesting, using AI to evaluate AI?
Yeah, so they would give GPT-4 specific questions about the relationships in the graph.
Like, is this relationship accurate?
And then they would have GPT-4 evaluate whether those relationships were plausible.
So like a second opinion from an AI.
Exactly. And they also did consistency checks, asking GPT-4 to look for any contradictions in the graph.
Making sure it all makes sense.
Yeah, and then Importantly, they also had human experts review the graph,
The gold standard.
the gold standard, and they measured the agreement between the different human reviewers using Cohen's kappa.
Which is a way to see how much they agree, taking into account chance agreement.
And the results were really promising. So when they compared SKG-LLM to other knowledge graphs out there, both general ones and ones specifically for stroke, it performed very well.
So it's holding its own against the competition.
Yeah, and in terms of the number of nodes and edges, it was right up there, indicating good coverage of the literature.
That's important. You want a knowledge graph that's comprehensive.
And when they compared it to Wikidata and WN18RR, it showed better precision and recall, especially when it was validated by those human experts.
So it's not just the AI saying it's good, the humans agree.
Yeah, and it also outperformed the existing stroke KG knowledge graph in terms of the F1 score.
So overall, a really strong performance.
And even in terms of just named entity recognition, being able to identify those key entities, incorporating GPT-4 into the process led to improvements.
So it's really showing the benefits of that combined approach.
Absolutely.
Now, they also talk about link prediction in the paper.
Yeah, which is this really cool idea of using the graph to predict new relationships.
So like, if you know A is related to B and B is related to C, can you predict that A is related to C?
Exactly, and they used these standard metrics for evaluating link prediction, like MR, MRR, and P at K.
Alphabet soup.
And they compared SKG-LLM to other algorithms that are specifically designed for link prediction.
So how did it do?
Well, it was good at predicting the top most likely relation, so that's P at 1.
Okay, so it can find the most obvious connections.
But when it came to the broader link prediction tasks, it didn't do quite as well as some of those specialized algorithms.
So there's still room for improvement.
Yeah, it suggests that, it's really good at extracting relationships that are already present in the data, but maybe not as good at generalizing to completely new relationships.
Which is a common challenge in knowledge graph research.
Yeah, finding that balance between accurately representing what you know and being able to predict what you don't know.
So, taking all of this into account, what are the real-world implications of this work?
Well, I think the researchers make a really strong case for SKG-LLM as a more efficient and potentially more accurate knowledge graph for stroke research.
Compared to what's currently available.
And that could have a huge impact on how research is done in this field.
Yeah, imagine being able to quickly and easily search through this vast knowledge graph, find connections that you might have missed otherwise.
And it could lead to new discoveries, new treatments, who knows?
And the fact that it's using this combination of LLMs and mathematical models, that's a really flexible approach that could be applied to other areas of healthcare as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's not just limited to stroke.
And I think the emphasis on human expert validation is really important.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that AI is a tool.
It's not a replacement for human expertise.
It's a way to augment our abilities to help us do things better and faster.
So it's that collaboration between humans and AI that's really powerful.
Absolutely. So this brings us to our novel notions segment where we like to, kind of speculate a bit.
Put on our futurist hats.
Yeah, what could be done in the future, building on this work?
So one idea that immediately comes to mind is, what about the dynamic evolution of knowledge?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Like, knowledge isn't static, right? It's constantly changing, evolving.
Especially in science.
Yeah, so what if you applied SKG-LLM to a series of publications over time?
Oh, like a time lapse of knowledge.
Exactly. You could see how the relationships between different concepts change, how our understanding evolves.
You could see what's emerging, what's becoming less important.
And maybe even use that to predict future research hotspots.
Or identify areas where knowledge is stagnating.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea.
And you could probably build on the existing work by incorporating time into the models themselves.
Like a time dimension in the tensor.
Exactly. Make it a four-dimensional data cube.
Now you're talking.
Okay, another idea, and this is a big one, but what about integrating this with real-world patient data?
Ooh, that's ambitious.
Yeah, so imagine taking this knowledge graph that's been built from the research literature and linking it to electronic health records.
So you're connecting the research to the actual patients.
Exactly, and you could potentially use that to personalize treatment recommendations.
Based on the individual patient's history and the vast knowledge that's been extracted from the research.
And maybe even identify patients who are at higher risk for certain complications.
Based on subtle patterns that might be too complex to spot otherwise.
Yeah, and I know this would be, super challenging.
Oh yeah, data privacy, data heterogeneity, making sure the information is accurate and reliable.
But the potential is huge. I mean, it could really revolutionize healthcare.
Truly personalized medicine.
Okay, before we get too carried away, just a reminder to our listeners that these novel notions are just speculative.
We're just brainstorming here?
Yeah, food for thought, but not necessarily, concrete research proposals.
But it's fun to think about the possibilities.
Absolutely. So to wrap up, I think this deep dive into the SKG-LLM paper has really shown the potential of this approach.
Yeah, combining LLMs and mathematical models to build these comprehensive, accurate knowledge graphs.
And specifically for stroke research, but it could really be applied to so many different areas.
It's a powerful tool for making sense of complex information.
And it's exciting to think about how it could accelerate research and lead to new discoveries.
And ultimately, improve patient outcomes.
So we definitely encourage everyone to check out the paper itself.
The link is in the episode description.
Yeah, go deeper, explore those details.
And we'll leave you with one final thought.
Okay.
As these LLMs become more and more sophisticated, how will these AI-constructed knowledge frameworks change the landscape of medicine?
It's a big question.
And it's one that we're all going to be grappling with in the years to come.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Always a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time on Talk Tensors.
Until then, keep on learning.
Keep on learning.